As someone looking from the west towards the east, I think this is a very appropriate first session, since the Greeks came into contact with the east through Western Asia Minor. And of course, it's the Lydians first, who were the nemesis and benefactors of the Greeks. And Herodotus begins his histories with this part. He even gives us information of the Lydians fighting with the Medes as anticipatory of what would happen when Croesus misinterprets the oracle and invades and fights the Persians, ending a great empire, which was his own. Elspeth Dusinberre is a perfect person to speak about this. She has done both Greek and Anatolian subjects and knows them very well. She started at the University of Michigan, doing a PhD with Margaret Root, specializing in Sardis, the great capital of Lydia that would become the western capital of the Achaemenid Empire. She has published widely. Her early work was on Achaemenid Sardis, and she's written two very important studies. Her first book, Aspects of Empire in Achaemenid Sardis, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2003. She also, and her most recent one is Empire, Authority, and Autonomy in Achaemenid Anatolia. She's also published on other aspects of this area, the finds at Gordian. She's published on the seals and sealings from Gordian and Phrygia, and is at work now on the aristocratic cremation burials found there with very interesting material. She also works on the Persepolis fortification tablets, a very broad view of text and material culture. She's presently professor in the classics department at the University of Colorado at Boulder. So without further ado, please welcome Elspeth Dusinberre.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Jeffrey. And thanks to today's organizers, particularly Rahim Shayegan, for inviting me to participate in today's symposium on ancient Persia and the West. The collaborative endeavor that UCLA, the Getty, and the Pourdavoud Center have created is a really magnificent example and opportunity for all of us here, and I must say I am thrilled to be a part of it. Today, as we embark on discussing Persia and the West, I want to start by considering what we mean by the West. Often when we think of the Achaemenid Persian Empire and Western encounters, we think of Greco-Persian interactions, particularly Greco-Persian conflict in the 5th century BCE. The dichotomy between Greeks and others is deeply rooted in European and North American scholarship. It means that the work being done by the Getty now, embedding Greece and Rome and their classical collections in their broader cultural contexts, is a superb example of the ways our understanding of the classical world is now being exploded open into richer discourse. We've made great strides in moving away from conceptualizing Greco-Persian interactions as embodying freedom versus slavery, democracy versus despotism, Europe versus the Orient, West versus East. But it is still tempting to think about the Achaemenid Empire as a cohesive thing, and its encounters with Greece as coherent and definable. Today, I want to try a slightly different approach. I want to think about what was happening in Anatolia in the first half century after Cyrus's conquests brought much of the area under Achaemenid hegemony around 550 BCE. Anatolia was, after all, the westernmost part of the Achaemenid Empire, and it was a place where many different kinds of encounters with different kinds of people might happen. Those people included European Greeks and Scythians, people outside the notional control of the empire. And it also included many different peoples who inhabited Anatolia itself. I want to think about some of those encounters as demonstrated by the material evidence, considering what they can tell us about the creation of empire. And I want to couch this discussion within the framework of borderlands analysis. UC Santa Barbara professor of history John Lee has recently offered a succinct summary of various processes defining the very complicated notion of borderlands. Borderlands, he says, are complex spaces that can involve military, religious, economic, political, and cultural interactions, all of which may vary by region and over time. The concept of borderlands has proven richly fruitful in recent historical scholarship, emphasizing the permeability of space and human culture, and the complicated interweaving of human encounters in the webbed zones where nations or ethnic groups or people with differing identities interact. In this talk, I will not consider processes of boundary construction, maintenance, or crossing. I will, however, consider some of the economic, political, social, and ethnic interactions in the borderlands that were Achaemenid Anatolia in the second half of the 6th century BCE. It is my hope that thinking of Anatolia at this time as comprising borderlands will help highlight the very complex concepts and processes involved in the creation and consolidation of the Achaemenid Empire after the military conquests that marked its start. Because these are enormous concepts, and Anatolia itself is an enormous area, I will limit myself to discussing two unpublished burials at Gordion, the ancient capital of Phrygia. These are both elite cremation graves situated under large tumuli. They are two of the earliest burials excavated from the Achaemenid period anywhere, dating to roughly 530 and 525 BCE, and they are two of the earliest securely datable archaeological contexts or deposits found within Achaemenid Anatolia as a whole. Both extravagantly wealthy, they highlight different processes in elite cultural development in the early Achaemenid period. They provide extraordinary insight into human encounters, interactions with Greeks, and the creation of empire here in the western parts of the Achaemenid Empire. At the time of the Persian conquest, around 540 BCE, Gordion's elite inhabitants were buried under great tumuli, established along ridges that increased the tomb's visual impact and apparent size, although the 6th century ones were all dwarfed by that vast monument, the Great Tumulus, made in the 8th century, apparently to mark the burial of King Gordios, father of the legendarily wealthy Midas of the Golden Touch. By the middle of the 6th century, the elite burials of Gordion included tumuli covering both traditional Phrygian wooden chambers and also cremation burials. Gordion is, to my knowledge, unique in having large-scale inhumations and cremations occurring at the same time. Around 530 to 525 BCE, two people died at Gordion. Their cremated remains were buried on the ridge to the northeast of the citadel mound under tumuli later excavated as Tumulus A and Tumulus E. At the moment, it's impossible to determine the ethnicity of these individuals, but the interment at Gordion earlier in the period of Achaemenid dominance gives us a snapshot of elite concerns and practices here in the western borderlands of the new empire. These burials demonstrate certain connections to other parts of Anatolia and beyond in the Achaemenid period. For instance, in the kinds of banqueting appurtenances I show here from other tombs elsewhere, not from Gordion, I'm cheating, but also in the inclusion of elaborate jewelry and furniture, imported or local artifacts with evocative iconography, and the carts used as hearses to draw the dead to their final resting spots. In this way, the tumuli fit well into the impression I have gained of the elite in Anatolia as a whole. But there are some spectacular elements to them that shed new light on the priorities of Gordian's ancient inhabitants and highlight aspects of changing behavior. These tumuli are exceptional, not only because conditions at Gordian allow for extraordinary preservations of various artifacts, including metal and ivory, but also because of the ways in which they illuminate societal developments, intercultural interactions, and local reactions to imperial impetus in the fertile and complicated western borderland zones. Tumuli E and A demonstrate some of the processes in the western borderlands of the empire that marked the creation of empire in the Achaemenid period, and that were so magnificently demonstrated in material of the later tombs near Ushak to the west of Gordian that I show you here. The people buried at Gordian drew on local traditions for their burials and treatments. True. But they also incorporated objects and ideas from Lydia and the Ionian Greek city-states along the Aegean to the west, from Egypt and Syria to the south, and from elsewhere. The result is something completely new. Each tumulus is unique in its combination of ideas and artifacts and in its cultural referencing. The tumuli highlight notions of social memory and shared ideology, and they show the development in these intricate borderlands of the remarkable cohesion that united and defined the polyethnic elite of the Achaemenid Empire in terms of their outward, elite, visible display of status. Here at Gordian, at the beginning of the Achaemenid period, we are able to see the beginnings of a socio-cultural phenomenon that was to prove defining in the Achaemenid Persian Empire across its vast extent and through the centuries of its might. Tumulus E is a puzzle, but one with an exciting picture. It was large, fully 65 meters in diameter. Its cremation burial has not been found, but the excavators in 1950 sought industriously for a chamber tomb without locating one, and it's safe to assume that a cremation was originally there. 2 pits under the tumulus yielded startling and important finds. One contained at least 9 skeletons of horses and cattle, carefully arranged in concentric circles. Horse burials are known from many places, of course, and even at Gordian, there are 2 horses each in Tumulus KY, dating circa 770, and Tumulus D, dating circa 560. But nowhere have I seen something like this. The Scythian kurgans sometimes included masses of horses, but they're arranged very differently than these and not mingled with cattle. The many other horse burials I have traced also resemble this one, not at all. It is, as far as I can tell, unique. It's an instance of mixing and developing ideas and practices in the fertile interstices of the borderlands that were Achaemenid Anatolia. The other pit, excavated within Tumulus E, held a large deposit of metal artifacts, including a bronze tripod cauldron and a large bronze dinos with iron loop handles. The tripod cauldron resembles artifacts from European Greece or the Greek colonies of Anatolia far more than it does those of Gordian's Phrygian past, and shows the importance of intermingling in this area. The cauldron had bronze legs riveted onto it, ending in cast lion's feet that are so dense and heavy it may be they include a high quantity of lead. The bowl of the cauldron was shallow, and the legs were tied together under it by a tripartite iron bar riveted onto each leg. The large iron loop handles of the dinos at left here ran through attachments shaped like simplified wings, a far cry from the elaborate dinoi of Gordian's illustrious past, but perhaps a reference to it, a recollection in the collective memory of those at Gordian now. In the pit were also found the iron fittings of 2 wheeled vehicles, dismantled at the time of their burial, now being studied by Gareth Derbyshire. There were additionally at least 5 horse bits of distinct shapes and sizes, with iron mouthpieces and bronze cheek pieces, including one that closely resembles the bits portrayed on the sculpted reliefs of the Persian capital Persepolis, carved a few decades later, well, possibly 1 decade later. One of the horse bits is particularly elaborate and provides a probable date for Tumulus E of circa 530 BCE. It's a single-jointed snaffle, the mouthpiece made of iron with a wire twisted about it, and with large bronze cheek pieces. The cheek pieces are decorated with palmettes that recall the painted warrior with his chariot on the walls of the tomb at Lishan Kızılbeyli, and the handles of bronze hydrii from Samos and elsewhere. The bit is completed by bronze rein rings in the form of ram's heads. When the horse was bridled, pressure on the reins would turn the ram's heads to the fore, so that as it galloped forward, anyone in its way would be confronted not only with its own on-rushing might, but also the fierce force of the little rams as well. There are no good comparanda for this artifact, and it demonstrates the remarkable intellectual and artisanal creativity possible in the borderlands that were Anatolia at the beginning of the Achaemenid period. The deposits overall find no precise parallels and open our eyes to a variety of ways a vast expenditure of wealth might mark a burial. The metalwares as a group connect the presumed occupant of the tomb to the developing practices and expressions of elite male authority across Achaemenid Anatolia in general. Indeed, throughout Anatolia, the Achaemenid period saw an emphasis on elite masculine participation in communal drinking and in difficult endeavor on horseback, particularly hunting and fighting. But I love it that the combination of horse sacrifice and the cauldrons resonates with Homeric overtones. And I think we should not dismiss the notion that such a reference to Greek heroic splendor might have been intentional in the case of Tumulus E. What a contrast we see when we turn to Tumulus A, a mound 31 meters in diameter, thus half the size, that covered the cremated remains and exceptionally wealthy associated grave goods of a young female who was buried around 525 BCE. A shallow pit was dug through a white laid clay floor. The ashes and bone chips from the cremation were partly interred here and partly in an imported Lydian amphora with pendant hooks dating around the middle of the 6th century BCE that was placed on the clay floor next to the pit. With the bones and ashes were several teeth that were described by the excavator as being small and therefore perhaps even juvenile, as well as wisps of burned textile and Angora rabbit fur. To the edge of the white floor were placed the iron fittings of a 2-wheeled vehicle, carefully dismantled and stacked, and 2 horse bits. This burial included a remarkable quantity of objects. No fewer than 8 Lydions were found, some of which were imported from the Lydian capital itself, Sardis. Many, but not all of them, were severely burned, probably in the cremation fire, and might have contributed their scented contents to the overall impact of that blaze. Also burned with the body was a pair of elaborate boat-shaped gold earrings with beaded wire and granulation. Another, almost identical pair was not burned, but rather mixed with the ashes later. The fact the mortuary artifacts included 2 virtually identical pairs of earrings highlights an important point. Jane Hickman is studying the jewelry from the cremation burials and points out there is far more jewelry interred in Tumulus A than any one person could have worn at any one time. This included 161 gold and electrum objects, including beads, pendants and chains, earrings, bracelets, and various miscellaneous items, including a probable rattle. Most of the jewelry was found with the bones and ashes in the burial pit. Some of it had been exposed to heat, and some not. Hickman reassembles the various items to count 2 pairs of earrings and at least 2 or perhaps as many as 4 necklaces, of which one was electrum and the rest gold. One of those included glorious golden acorn pendants. In addition, there were 2 bracelets, pendants on chains, and, of course, the rattle. This rattle, decorated in a manner similar to those found at Sardis and Ushak, most likely had gold beads inside. Unmarried female burials of the Archaic period were often very wealthy around the Aegean. But I wonder if there are other things going on here as well. Overall, the quality of the jewelry in Tumulus A, with some notable exceptions, is not as good as that seen in the somewhat later Ushak tombs, published as the Lydian treasure that Meg Miller has demonstrated were locally produced. Those objects displayed more granulation and greater variety than our earlier artifacts from Gordian. The material in Tumulus A, with its varied craftsmanship, is probably the product of multiple workshops. Some of it may have been imported from elsewhere in Anatolia, and Hickman draws particular connections to workshops at Lydian Sardis and Greek Ephesus in her study. This variety thus attests to the intermingling of ideas and practices in the western borderlands of the empire. The most probable explanation for the quantity of material found in Tumulus A, however, is that it was tribute paid to someone important who died. Greek literary sources describe multiple instances of such behavior on the part of Lydians, Phrygians, and various Greeks with close connections to them, instances in which jewelry was added to graves as tribute in association with human death. Those stories are borne out by the discovery in the great tumulus at Gordian of dozens of bronze fibulae, apparently contained in a cloth bag and deposited at the bier of King Gordios, father of Midas himself, an offering that Richard Liebhardt has long suggested should be understood as tribute. This is interesting in itself, but there are 2 points of real significance here as we consider the role of the fertile borderlands in the process of creating empire and crafting elite cohesion as an element in overarching imperial identity. One is that this is a part of the world where people were very aware of each other's jewelry and wealth, where these expressions of elite culture were on display and bore meaning. Another has to do with the communication of ideas through publicly visible signifiers. One of the most striking items from Tumulus A is a gold bracelet with lion's head terminals. This is a splendid example of a shape that was common in the Achaemenid Empire. It provides a clear link between elite display at Gordian and elite display elsewhere in the empire. And the fact that a second, less high quality version of such a bracelet was also buried in Tumulus A shows part of how the process of elite homogenization might have worked. We see here at Gordian less skilled, or perhaps less practiced, workshops endeavoring to create the trademarks of elite expression in use at the same time as first-rate examples in the 6th century. This combination now lets us see the noble, locally made artifacts of the later Ushak tombs as the expert result of traceable cultural and artistic developments. The increased communication across these western borderlands in the Achaemenid period, for which there's now much evidence, enabled the sharing of ideas and behaviors to lead to a remarkable similarity of elite expression combined with continuity in particular local customs. The agency of the elite and the artifacts they displayed and used helped create cohesive imperial power at all levels of society. A few last artifacts from Tumulus A help us better understand the complex cultural situation at Gordian at the time of this death and its interactions with Greek societies to the east, the west. Small, black-polished, shallow bowls and a gray trough-spouted jug suggest connections to traditional Phrygian dining, along with sherds of black and gray jugs, jars, and bowls. And the excavators also found remnants of a traditional Phrygian bronze bowl and an elaborate bronze jug that resembles East Greek jugs in appearance, but was made using local metalworking techniques. Ceramic and stone spindle whorls were found buried in the pit. 2 likely East Greek imports are these ivory fragments, part of a horse-head furniture attachment with stylistic connections to the horses on the Siphnian treasury at Delphi, and the torso of a Kore wearing a chiton and holding a hare that Phoebe Sheftel ascribes to an Ionian artist working around 530 to 525 BCE. Also East Greek is this terracotta unguentarium in the shape of a kore holding a bird in both hands that Irene Romano suggests was probably made in Miletus and dates around 540 to 530. Unburned, it was broken in two pieces and mixed with the ashes at the top of the pit, perhaps adding the fragrance of its contents to the burial. One piece, a silver mirror found with Phoenician-style ivory volutes attached by silver nails on either side of its handle flange, is probably an import from farther south. This alabaster alabastron and another that makes a matched pair closely resemble those that found in Achaemenid period tombs in Lydia, but may be imported from Egypt. And two pieces are, to my knowledge, unique. This ivory duck box traces its ancestry to Egypt and the Levant, although it is of an apparently unparalleled type. The style of its carving reminds me of Lydia. And this was probably an ivory rhyton, or drinking horn. It was incised and colored with purple and yellow. Its upper frieze shows 3 geese or ducks walking to the left, while the frieze below preserves a double-banded circle with very faintly incised lines that divide it into 8 even parts. I am aware of no contemporary parallels. The ducks, with their mutual interactions even as they move forward, remind me in little in mood of the incised silver alabastra from the Ushak tombs. Here's one of them. The wheel with the 8 spokes appears frequently on the seals of the Persepolis Fortification Archive, dating a little later than this tomb. There, it may signify a cosmic wheel of life, or some related notion of harmony, cycles, and 8-part divisions. Thus, Tumulus A and Tumulus E highlight the wide reach of human interactions at Gordian in the early stages of the Achaemenid Empire, in geographical, artisanal, visual, material, and behavioral terms. They allow us to see imperial processes at play in the western reaches of the empire, and to think in slightly different ways about the concepts of borderlands. The idea of borderlands allows us to transcend political and cultural boundaries, to consider the complex processes of the various interactions lying at the intersection of frontiers, borders, and boundaries. Frontiers involve space and action. They're moving and often expanding areas at the fringes of settlement, engagement, or sometimes conflict. A border represents a usually relatively static model of territorial demarcation. And boundary is a term usefully employed to describe mental constructs and discourses that help define and divide overlapping spheres of human behavior and identity. Borderlands, as we've seen, are the space where these notional differences break down, where people and ideas mingle. Achaemenid Anatolia, in the first decades of its conquest, functioned as the western borderlands of the new empire. As it came under Achaemenid hegemony, previously existing borders between states were torn down and the frontiers of human interactions shifted. The degree of social, economic, religious, and other human interaction across spaces and notional boundaries observable in the archaeological record skyrocketed throughout Anatolia in the Achaemenid period. Tumulus E and Tumulus A, 2 of the earliest datable Achaemenid tombs anywhere, give us a glimpse of what was happening in the first 15 or so years after the Achaemenid conquest of Gordian. The fertility of borderlands interactions offered tremendously increased opportunity for elite identity expressions, new potential depth and motion in behaviors, shifting frontiers in human as well as geographical terms. At the same time, the evidence from Gordian lets us understand the empire as possessing borderlands both in terms of its encounters with European Greece or other areas outside its hegemony, and also within its own newly conquered territories. It's here that we can trace the very development of that cohesive elite identity that was to characterize the Achaemenid Persian Empire, to allow for definedly Achaemenid interactions with non-Achaemenid. Thus, Western encounters and the new possibilities they engendered had long-lasting impact on imperial expression in the Achaemenid Empire as a whole, and in the socio-political entities that interacted with and succeeded it. Thank you.
So I suppose my question to you is, how do you tie this in? I think we have to look at Sardis as the major place for manufacture, but you believe that some were made in Gordian and elsewhere. What are the links between these areas and then the Greeks as well? Is there a way to? Well, I'm the only one with a microphone here.
So, sorry, the question is, what were the links between Sardis and the rest of Anatolia?
Or Gordian and even
Gordian.
How do you view this progression from place to place over this, and the transition from pre-Achaemenid to formative Achaemenid?
Well, it's a huge question.
Yes, it is. Yes.
Of course, you're right that most people now think that Sardis was a massive production center in the 6th century up to and then through the early Achaemenid period. And indeed that much of what's been found at Ephesus that used to be called Greek probably isn't. What I see happening in Anatolia as a whole following Cyrus's conquest is that the intercultural interaction across the whole peninsula increases dramatically. So that you see a huge amount of shared ideas, shared production techniques and practices, and then overall across Anatolia. So that the creation of empire creates a huge upswing in human interaction in ways that are fascinating. I think at Gordian, these two tumuli are startling in that they show the beginnings of a cohesive elite expression. Because they're so early in the history of the Achaemenid period, they give us, and because of Tumulus A, we get a chance to see this creation of cohesion at the same time as a real variety of expression of what it means to be awesome. And that's unique at Gordian because of the dating of the tumuli. But they show us something that's clearly very well established by 500.
Thank you. Are there other questions for Elspeth? Yes, Henry.
The Dinos in Tumulus E, the handles on that struck me because the wings combined with the actual loop handle actually creates the appearance of a sort of winged disc. So I wonder how that sort of figures into this complex picture of creating empire at this very early stage when Achaemenid iconography itself is still being developed at Persepolis and elsewhere.
So, Henry, that is an awesome observation and one that I hadn't noticed at all. Spectacular. Let's see, how would it factor in? I mean, I'm inclined to think, or I had been inclined to think, that the wings on that Dinos handle were simply a cultural reference to Gordian's past. But you're right, that certainly by 10, 15 years later, we're seeing the figure in the winged disc prominently displayed at Persepolis. And I think that, yeah, it could well be that this sort of thing is developing at Gordian now. Particularly when you think about the color contrast between the bronze of the wings, which would have shown rather golden, and that sort of dark, shiny nature of the iron loop handles as well. So I hadn't thought of it, but I expect you're right, that could be something really exciting.
Well, there's no reason that it's not still a reference to Gordian's past as well. I think it works really well as both. I
think that's right, and maybe so having it be both of those at once, I'll just repeat that Henry just said, that there's no reason it wouldn't be both. Yes, I think that, and of course that's the part of the beauty of visual referencing is that it can be multivalent.
Thanks very much. I have a question about the Borderlands framework. If we were proceeding just from a bare reading of material culture, that is to say, if we didn't have literary texts and inscriptions that told us that southwestern Iran was more or less the core of the empire. Is there anywhere in the Achaemenid Empire that wouldn't be a borderland, where we wouldn't have a mixing of several different artistic traditions, grave goods, and so on? Or another way of asking that, is there something about Achaemenid Anatolia that is particularly fertile, and is there anything about borderlands mixing that distinguishes it from other parts of the empire where there is mixing and a confluence of different traditions?
Oh, I love this question because this was exactly the question I was hoping to spark.
Oh, good.
The quick answer is no. And so I think what's exciting about borderlands as a concept and thinking about imperial construction is that it's all kind of borderlands within a new imperial enterprise until things have kind of settled down. So if they settle down, so that we have a sense, because our literary sources are so predominantly external and Western, I think we do have a sense of the Achaemenid Empire and Achaemenid ideas. But actually, especially when things are just mingling at the beginning and everybody's trying to figure out which way is up, and wait, if you just usurped the throne, do you still get to be king? How does that work? In fact, no, there's a great deal of interaction in a way that is precisely what the notion of borderlands is trying to explain. What makes Anatolia different, I think, is three things. One is that there's an enormous variety of age-old cultures within a relatively confined geographical area of the Anatolian Peninsula. So tons of different peoples who had previously been distinct and separate. So that's one thing. Another thing is that we do have an enormous amount of evidence for Anatolia that allows us to consider it from a lot of different directions at once. So it enables triangulation to get at a single question. And the third thing is that I just happen to know more about it than other areas.
Thank you very much. Maybe to follow up on that, because there has always also, apologies, been a lot of talk about middle ground. And I think the middle ground is exactly what you mean with borderland. So is there a kind of difference between them? And I think then the follow-up question would be, because I agree with Jake that, I mean, also the center of the empire, if you see what comes together over there, you could see it as a kind of middle ground. I mean, Persepolis is also so eclectic in itself and taking in a lot of different influences from everywhere. So what, and actually, and that's the follow-up question, is the meaning of the word imperial? So you're talking about the formation of an imperial identity, but could you also say that it's just a broadening of the repertoire that takes place?
That imperial implies a broadening of the material and cultural.
Yeah. Is it okay? It's just a little low.
Oh, of course. Is this, whoa. So that's such an interesting question. I'm just thinking first about the concept of borderlands as opposed to middle lands. I'm buzzing. Is that better? And I wonder if some of that might be temporal. That is, because borderlands are so integrally associated conceptually with notions of frontiers and sort of shifting interactions, that borderlands may be a particularly useful construct in thinking about the creation of an imperial identity or imperial identities. Whereas the middle lands notion allows us to think about continuingly shifting ideas and practices, even once things are better established. So for me, imperialism in the context that you're just highlighting absolutely has to do with behavior. And it's through the behaviors and how people practice identities and notions that conception of imperialism can be taken as real, both within an empire and without. So the fact that it worked, I think, is demonstrated by the notion that we even think of an Achaemenid Empire or the Achaemenid Empire, and that our primarily Greek textual sources tend to talk about Persians per se, where that may be an ethnic misleading notion. Did that answer your question? Would you like to ask it again, and I'll see if I can do better?
No, well, maybe one follow-up question, because it's of course a fundamental point. I mean, the moment if you use the term imperial, you are supposing that they are communicating, of course, with the center. And it's not really clear with whom they are communicating here. I mean, if you have a shared language of let's say, visual culture or material culture, as we see here, that's not to say that everybody using that shared set of symbols means the same thing by it. So the fact, as you implied yourself, that they have things from a very different worlds, so that they are apparently more part of a global world than they were earlier, that might have been talking to local communities or local elites, and not necessarily, let's say, to the imperialistic center.
Thank you. Okay, so I love the fact that you return to the notion of center in this regard. And I think I love it precisely because I myself no longer think it's a useful construct in thinking about imperialism or empires. That is, for so long, I think our scholarly discourse has focused on notions of center and periphery, imperial centers, the heartland of the empire, yada, yada, yada. And I don't think that is a useful way to think about the Achaemenid Empire at any rate, and I suspect empires in general. It seems to me that what makes sense instead is to think about different kinds of notions of authority and different kinds of autonomy that people exert. So that when we're looking at something like empire construction in Anatolia, I would seriously doubt that people were thinking about Persepolis ever. Except maybe the few people who were homesick for it. and so that instead what we're seeing is a creation, a buying into and a practicing of certain kinds of authority, which we couch in terms of imperialism. At the same time that people have real autonomy that they can exert in terms of not only personal taste, but also expressions and behaviors to do with, for instance, religious practices or education. Or in Anatolia, we see a surprising and interesting disjunct between the grave goods with which people are buried, where the elite all look alike, or what look like rather geographically specific tomb structures, which are extremely different from one area to the next. So I don't think that center is a concept that matters in Anatolia at this point.
However, if you have the notion of an imperial imprint anywhere that might even adopt to indigenous and regional gusto and accommodate those, you must have some normative sets, specifically in the case of the dissemination of inscriptions and the content of those inscriptions, that there are indeed central authorities very much in charge of that. This is not a matter of local elites or local satraps disseminating that. There is a desire to disseminate the discourse of the empire by making it palpable, agreeable to the mental makeup of the specific regions and satrapies or even people, be it even oral dissemination. So there is a centrality in a certain agency in doing that, setting the tones, creating the normativity. So even though we might not see it within the context of art dissemination or the adoption of Persian motifs within different regions of Anatolia, there is another discourse going on. And that discourse has a centrality embedded in it. And these two discourses cannot be disjointed from each other. So we cannot entirely dispense with the notion of centrality in one form or another, because then we don't have any normativity. And without that, then we can't understand who is actually disseminating this content so well adopted to the mental makeup of the different regions to which they are being sent. Any question, well, actually any response to that? Not questions, because I asked a question.
I assume when you're talking about inscriptions that are disseminated, in your mind, for instance, is the Behistun inscription of which a copy has been found at Elephantini, the fact that Herodotus clearly knows it, and so on. And I think there are many, many examples of expressions of overarching imperial authority, whether it be through the inscriptions that you've mentioned, or I actually beg to differ. I think that the iconography with specifically Persian images is also found throughout the empire. So I can see why the notion of centrality remains attractive. My own sense is that if we think of it instead as the sort of apex of imperial authority, then we dissociate it from a geographical locus in a way that's very useful in terms of thinking about imperialism and how it works. So that not all things need to originate with the king in either a physical or a notional center, but rather having the sort of the uber authority of the king or imperial expressions, whether it be through inscriptions or visual culture, architectural culture, or behavioral practices, is tremendously useful.
Those even have the same ductus that we have in Persepolis. So these are people who have been trained at some time within a central, within a central place where they have learned the same ductus. So there is a notion of a shared paideia among the so-called administration of the empire. Hence, at least as a construct, the central, the notion of a center is not entirely to be debunked yet, in my opinion. Otherwise, we cannot explain those matters. Thank you so much, and I'm done.
I agree completely with that. And the notion of a shared paideia is something with which I agree wholly. So if we think about centralized production, I'm with you 100%.